Okay. Light band will turn red. I think we're good. Okay, good morning. Thank you all for joining. We're going to talk about Docker and Drupal, local Drupal development on Docker today. My name's Andy Heap. I'm Drupal practice lead at Slalom. I've been working with Drupal for a good decade. Pretty new to Docker still, though. If you haven't heard of Slalom, we are a 5,000 person consulting organization. We have offices around the country as well as London and Toronto. And our Drupal practice is growing, so if you're interested, please come find me, get in touch, let's talk. We're headquartered in Seattle, but we do have an office here in Portland as well. All right, this is what we're going to cover today. It's ambitious. We are going to start with some context setting and some background, talking about history of local Drupal development, the quick version that may seem paradoxical, but we're going to go for it. A little bit of intro to Docker, some concepts, terminology, just a quick overview. High level, how Drupal and Docker work together. And then we're going to compare these three tool sets, Docker for Drupal, Doxil, and Lando. And then we'll wrap up, have some discussion, review. For each of those tool sets, we're going to cover some common territory. What is it? What's installation look like? What's working with applications look like? Quick demo, show you a couple things, and just do some comparison on some common points across all three of them. Tragically, I'm going to tell you right now, Mac updated on me about 15 minutes ago, and Docker is still trying to restart, so my demo is going to be really short. I wasn't going to demo much anyway, but it's going to be showing some config files, I'm afraid. A couple things you're going to have to take my word on. Classic conference stuff. All right, so let's go through some history really quick. How many people in here have been working with Drupal for more than 10 years? I know some of you. More than 5? More than 1? Okay, so a lot of this will be familiar to this group. In the early days, there was bare metal. We would install local servers directly on our workstations, maybe install Apache and MySQL directly on a Linux box, or we'd use MAMP, WAMP, XAMPP, some combination thereof. And that got us started. That was okay. It was a good starting point. But there's some problems with that approach. It's really hard to manage multiple versions of those servers, for example. It's hard to sync what you're doing locally with what the production environment's ultimately going to look like. You really can't share your local setup with other developers. So we get a lot of the works for me phenomenon. Can't even reproduce bugs on different environments, for example. So that got us started, but had a lot of problems and limitations. Then came along virtualization, and first pass here was virtual machines. So a lot of you probably worked with Drupal VM or Acquia Dev Desktop or something custom built on VirtualBox, and that addressed a lot of the issues that we had with bare metal. We can package up the kind of metadata about our development environment and store that in our repository and share that. So that's great. But VMs are slow, they're big, they're clunky, they're monolithic, gigabyte files. So it's slow to get them, it's slow to provision them. Maintenance within the VM is hard. It's hard to distribute that across your teams well. So there were some limitations of the virtual machine approach as well. That brings us to containers. Containers are another type of virtualization. Here's a concise-ish definition that I like from an article on InfoWorld. Linux containers are self-contained execution environments that share the kernel of the host operating system. So, in other words, they're like VMs, but all of the containers you're running on a given host are sharing the same OS. And every container is just running as its own process on the host machine. Here's the kind of obligatory slide in any Docker presentation. You have some image like this, but at a glance it hopefully illustrates some of the benefits we were just talking about you can see how much lighter weight every container is compared to a VM, which is bringing along the entire OS with it. So containers are smaller and faster than VMs. They're flexible, they're modular, they're a lot easier to maintain and share across environments. They're portable, share with other developers. They're portable across environments, and they scale really well. So that's how we've landed at containers. So that said, what is Docker? This is not entirely obvious, but containers and Docker are not synonymous. They're two different things. Docker grew out of the Linux containers. It kind of evolved from that. Docker is a company and open source set of open source tools that really brought containers to the mainstream and made them usable for folks like us, for mere mortals. There is a distinction between the Community Edition and the Enterprise Edition of Docker. Community Edition is the one that's relevant to us today as far as facilitating local development environments. Enterprise Edition is more focused on enterprise production infrastructure. And it's important to remember Docker is less than 5 years old. It's relatively new. Also, interesting aside, I noticed in working on this talk that docker.com is running on Drupal. So let's go through some terminology. There's a whole world to Docker, but here's some of the concepts that are going to be relevant to what we're talking about today. I'll just go through them quickly, and they're going to keep coming up throughout the talk. I remember to do this real quick. So images and containers. An image is essentially like a blueprint for a container, and a container is a simplistic way of thinking about it. A container is conversely a running instance of that image. You might have multiple containers running from the same image at a given time, for example. A Docker registry, of which Docker Hub is kind of the canonical example, but you could run your own registry if you wanted. That's a place where kind of blessed images are versioned and stored. So Docker Hub is kind of the canonical place to go if you want to just browse around what images are available. Services and microservices. So a service is an independent piece of the application that's exposed to the rest of the application via a well-defined API. And you might have heard of this concept of microservices as well. Microservice architecture, generally speaking, for our purposes today, it refers to an application that's a collection of loosely coupled small services. Docker Compose is a tool for managing apps that have multiple containers. And again, we'll be circling back on all this, but just a quick intro. A stack is a group of services that work together. So for example, we're going to look at Doxil. Doxil has an Acquia stack where it's like a set of services that are really tuned to mimic the Acquia production environment. And then volumes, really important, quick point on volumes. So volumes are a way to persist data outside of containers. A container by default, if you spin it down, if you destroy it, all of your data in there is gone. You can recreate the container, but if you're actually making changes to the file system, you want to use what's called a volume, which is a way to map the file system on your local host to file system within a given container. Installing Docker is pretty straightforward, despite the problem I had just before. Trust me, it's easy. There's Docker for Mac, Docker for Windows now that are really straightforward. They do require recent versions of the OS to run Docker natively. Otherwise, you get into things, if you have an older version, I think it's Windows 10 Professional, for example, that you need to have to run Docker for Windows. Otherwise, you get into actually installing a VM, ironically. There are small VMs that Docker will install for older versions of those operating systems, and then you can run Docker on that. And that will help mitigate some, well, it's required on older versions of those OSs. There are also some issues with Mac and Windows. I was just talking to Andrew before the talk about file system performance issues on Mac, for example. It's a little bit slow. File system reads from Docker, for example. So that's a thing to be aware of. There's active work, like there's a ton of active development obviously happening in the Docker space to address some of these issues, so it's coming along, but something to be aware of. What does it look like to actually work with applications in Docker? You'll notice these are Docker Compose commands. Docker itself, the command line, is really a set of lower level commands for working with images, maybe defining, building an app. Most of the time, like once you have your app defined, you're going to interact via Docker Compose. And it's a tool, again, it's going to let you interact with your local setup across all the containers. So here are some commands if you want to start up your app once you have a Compose file in place. It's just this Docker Compose up. The -D will make it happen, make it run in the background as opposed to your current shell. Docker Compose PS is a way to list all the containers, including the container names. See some kind of meta information about the containers that are running. You can see logs from any given container really easily. You have to be able to identify the name of the container you care about, which again you can get from Docker Compose PS. Stopping, really straightforward, and again the difference between stop versus down. If you run Docker Compose down, you will bring down, you will essentially destroy all of your containers. You will lose all the data that's in them unless you had set up volumes like we talked about a minute ago. Alright, so a few quick notes on Docker and Drupal and what that looks like. Somebody give me a time check really quick too. I just want to make sure.
10:30, 15 minutes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So just at a high level, a few notes about what Docker and Drupal working together looks like. So typically, you're going to have a few containers, right? Like we kind of get the gist of what we need from Drupal application. We essentially need a container for a web server, a container for the database. There may be a separate one for PHP, depending on how you're running it. In a sense, thinking about Drupal requirements, that's what you need, just a handful of containers. But if you've worked with any Drupal application of any complexity, you know there's a lot of other pieces as well. You might have separate containers or separate services for Solar, Varnish, etc. A lot of the tools we're going to look at have ways to just drop those in place that are really straightforward. But just to start to think about what a Docker-based Drupal app looks like, each of these are going to be running in separate containers. Mostly Docker for Drupal to date is really focused on local development environments. A lot of Drupal hosts are using container technology for sure, but to my knowledge, not a lot of them are actually using Docker in production. We're mostly talking about local development with Docker. Pantheon in particular has done a lot of pioneering work with container technology in their hosting environment, and that predates Docker even. So we're really talking about local development. But you'll also see a lot of hosts are starting to make recommendations about using some of these tools. So for example, Larry Garfield just published an article about how they recommend Lando at platform.sh. And they talk about how to tool it, how to set it up so that it really mimics the platform production environment really well. So those kind of recommendations are starting to come out as well. Oops. There's a lot of options out there. It's a really active space right now. The top three we're going to talk about here in a minute, but there's all these other ones as well. Phase 2 dev tools I'd never heard of until I was researching this talk, but I stumbled onto it. DDev. There is a Drupal Docker initiative which is attempting to gather kind of Best practice images and documentation. I can't speak to how people rate that, but it's out there. Drupal VM has a Docker version now, and there is also a Drupal image on Docker Hub. In both of those last two cases, it's a single service application, so it's not really embracing Docker best practices. At least that's my understanding of Drupal VM. If anybody knows otherwise, please holler. So they're not really embracing kind of Docker best practices, but you're still going to get a lot of benefits from using them over a VM. And you can just create your own application pretty easily with a custom Docker Compose file. So there's a lot of work happening out there. It's a really active space. Lando, we're going to talk about, it's in really active development. I know there's been some discussion about consolidating some of these efforts. I hope we can kind of strike the right balance. On the one hand, diversity of this kind of ecosystem is a good thing, but hopefully we don't have like crazy fragmentation either. So I hope there's going to be some work to consolidate some of these efforts. All right, so that brings us to our first tool set we're going to talk about, which is Docker for Drupal. It's maintained by a company called Wadby. Does anybody in here use Wadby out of curiosity for like actual production deployments? Doubt it? Okay. It's a really interesting case because despite what I said a minute ago about Docker and Drupal not being in production very often, Wadby is the example I know of where their business is geared around you provide them a hosting service, you provide them a code repo, and they'll actually do the Docker orchestration and deployment to production for you. So that's Wadby's model. As we saw here anecdotally, I don't think there's a whole lot of usage yet, but it's really interesting what they're trying to do. And so the Docker for Drupal as the local development environment is essentially kind of a backport of that to a local development environment. That said, it's a really good one to start with because it's really kind of bare bones. What you get from Docker for Drupal is just a really nice tuned Docker Compose file. And so it's really kind of vanilla Docker that you're working with kind of a layer of pulling it together for purposes of Drupal development in particular. They do have a bunch of stacks that you can use for deploying different applications to production, but it's kind of a vanilla implementation of Docker for Drupal. That said, installation is very simple. If you've got Docker in place already, you're done. You don't need to do anything extra to get Docker for Drupal going. So, and again, we're going to tick through each of these slides now with each of the three tool sets here coming up so we can do kind of as close as possible to an apples-to-apples comparison. What does it look like to actually set up an application on Docker for Drupal? We're going to assume for each of these that we already have our Drupal code base, right? Like we've created it locally, we've cloned it from a GitHub repo, it's sitting on our local host. We're going to start with that assumption. We essentially want to wrap all of this Docker metadata around it. So all we have to do for Docker for Drupal is download their Docker Compose file. We have a little manual work to do within that Compose file. We have to uncomment an image because we already have our code base. We have to change a few paths for the volumes that I talked about. There's a little kind of manual tinkering, but it's just a YAML file we have to go in and tinker with a little bit. And then we need to edit our etc host file. We have to set up the networking on our local hosts really quickly ourselves. So at least just point a domain that we want to use to our local host. And then because it's just straight up Docker, the command to start it up is just the vanilla Docker Compose up. So it's just those few steps, and then we have a local site running. What we get out of the box, the services that we get out of the box with Docker for Drupal is Nginx as a web server, a PHP service, and MariaDB service as well. There's some other kind of system services, Mailhog, Portainer traffic, but really when we're thinking about a Drupal application, it's those three. the database, the web server, and PHP. So what does it actually look like once we have our app set up to interact with the application? Starting and stopping is just what we've already seen. Now we get into some weirdness a little bit. We can use the Docker Compose exec file to actually execute commands within our containers, right? This is a really common thing we're going to want to do. With Docker for Drupal, it's a little tricky. You'll see this user 82, which you'd probably be scratching your head about. I was when I first saw it. That is the default user ID, group ID on Alpine Linux, which is the small Linux distro that Docker for Drupal uses for its containers. So you have to actually explicitly pass that in. There's things you could do to work around this. You could set up local aliases, etc., but you have to pass in the user ID, assuming, the user ID, group ID for the www data user, which is probably the one you want to be executing your commands as. So specifying the user, naming the container, which is called PHP. That is not the command PHP, that is the name of the container in this example. And then whatever command we wanted to execute. So if we wanted to see the present working directory in the PHP container, that's what the command looks like. If we want to drop into an interactive shell, we could do the same thing, but we just execute bash, and then we'd be dropped into a shell in that PHP container. Seeing logs is very straightforward. If we want to add or change a service, so let's imagine again like a kind of vanilla Drupal setup. We've got our web server, we got our database, we got PHP running. Let's imagine we want to add Solr. All that's involved with that is to actually, in the case of Solr, we just have to uncomment some YAML config that's in the Docker Compose file that Docker for Drupal provides us. Just adding an entry to that service is key. We could add in other services as well. As long as they're recognized Drupal or Docker images, we can just add other entries to the services key in the Compose file. Here are a little bit more about working with applications, some of our favorite Drupal commands. Again, looks kind of ugly. We got to pass in the user ID, for example. There's ways we can work around it, but that's what we're dealing with from vanilla Docker. Drush, also for some reason, I don't know if anybody's come across this that's worked with Docker for Drupal, but it seems you have to pass in the path to the web root as well, explicitly. I'm not sure why, but anyway, otherwise, like the commands are pretty straightforward once we understand the kind of pieces we have to pass in. Interacting with Drush, with console, with Composer, that's what it looks like. If we want to actually execute PHP, a script directly or pass in another file, this is what the command looks like. There's that double PHP. Remember, the first one is identifying the name of the container, and the second one would be to actually say we want to execute the PHP command. MySQL shell looks like that. Database import and export. It's a little funky to get databases imported. You have to actually put them into a specific directory before you bring up the container. But anyway, this is a kind of a snapshot of what it looks like to work with a Docker for Drupal application locally. What kind of extras do we get with Docker for Drupal? Not a whole lot, again, because it's bare bones by its nature. If you are interested in the WADV service, then you get that, obviously, and this is a really nice tool. There's a lot of drop-in services we can add just by tinkering with the Docker Compose file that are kind of ready to go. But pretty much that's it. So each of these tool sets has a terminal slide. I'm going to go show you some stuff. I'm going to show you a lot less stuff than I had hoped to, unfortunately. But let's at least take a look at, oops, if I can find the right, okay. And if I can get my mouse over there, okay. So you can see I have sample projects set up for each of these tool sets. Let's see. And let's just look at the compose file. So this is a generic Docker Compose file, you can see Docker for Drupal's done a lot of work to put in a lot of the common options we're going to care about in here. And you could kind of just toggle on and off if you want a different version of a certain image. For example, you can uncomment specific lines. You can see that the kind of top level entries under services are the 3 services that we talked about: MariaDB, PHP, and Nginx. If we wanted to say add Redis, we just really have to uncomment those couple lines. Restart Docker. Oh, is that hard to see? Thanks, Josh. Oops. Come on, you can read that, right? Okay, is that better? More?
More.
Thumbs up, thumbs down? I'm with you. How's that? Okay. All right. See all that now? Here's our top level services. And again, Wadby's done a lot of work to get common configuration changes in here so that you would just need to uncomment, comment particular lines in here, and it's just YAML. But it's a lot to look at, right? Like, this is a massive file, and so it's this is kind of what we get with Docker for Drupal. So let's move on to Doxil. And we're going to kind of compare those same points. We're going to start to see patterns that emerge and some of the differences. And then, again, we'll circle back at the end. So Doxil is created by, maintained by FFW, Drupal agency. With Doxil, we start to get into a lot of abstractions now. Like Doxil is doing things to kind of save us from some of the Dockerisms, for better or for worse. We'll see what a configuration file looks like in a minute, for example, and it's a lot simpler than what we just looked at. But so we're getting into Docker abstractions. And Doxil, by the way, was formerly known as Druid, if anybody heard that before. I think Doxil's a better name. Kudos. So with Doxil, all you really need to get going is, once you have Doxil installed, is a .doxil directory in your local project. And there's a lot we can do within that directory, from no config to like going crazy. Anything we can do with Docker, we can package in there. But again, it's abstracting a lot of things away. There's not even a Docker Compose file, for example. And so you can't just run straight up Docker Compose commands either, but that's all created dynamically at runtime. A Compose file, for example. Doxil has a really powerful command line tool named Fin that gives us a lot of power and flexibility out of the box. You'll see, just it's easy to see at a glance when we look at the different commands for working with applications, what Fin gives us. So just as far as like a really concise, nice syntax and abstracting away a lot of the messiness from vanilla Docker, Fin's really powerful. It also can be extended. We can add custom Fin commands, etc. I'll talk a little bit more about it. Doxil is interesting because as of now, it installs a virtual machine as well that will be deprecated in favor of native Docker, but for now it installs a virtual machine, and that VM is supposed to help mitigate those file system performance issues that we talked about on Mac, for example, as well as some Windows networking issues. The VM is tiny. It runs a tiny Linux distribution called boot to Docker, which is really made for this purpose, but you do have to deal with a VM, right? So startup time for all of Doxil, for example, is a little bit slower. You have to get that VM running, and it runs in the background, but it's a little bit slower. Anecdotally, it feels like it's a little bit quicker than other options like Lando, for example, that don't use a VM. But it's just an interesting thing to note. Doxil is focused on Drupal and WordPress, essentially, LAMP limp, whatever you want to call it, applications, but WordPress as well. What does installing Doxil look like? It's pretty straightforward. Again, there's you've got Docker in place already. So one interesting caveat: if you're on Windows, Doxil requires you to install a shell called Baboon. I'd never heard of it before. I don't know how what kind of shells people typically run on Windows anyway, but that is a requirement. If you're using Windows, you have to install this shell, and that's in order to support Fin. So something to be aware of. An interesting note about that is that requirement's going to be deprecated as Windows subsystem for Linux matures. So that requirement will go away as well. But as for now, there's that extra step you need to take on Windows. And if you're running on Linux and you do happen to have some other servers, like bare metal servers working, if you got a local installation of Apache, you might have a little work to do to resolve some port conflicts, but pretty straightforward. And then Doxil has a nice installer. So pretty straightforward to get it set up. What does it look like to actually create an application? Again, we're assuming we have a Drupal code base. All you need is that Doxil directory. In the case of Doxil, you can specify, again, they have this separate Acquia stack. If you're going to be deploying to production on Acquia, you want to use that stack because your local is going to mimic the production environment really closely. You can also generate a compose file if you want to do the manual config. So you can tell Doxil, like, give me the kind of vanilla Docker compose file and I'm going to tinker with it directly. So your configuration options run from none. Again, like I can just create .doxil as a directory and start Doxil and I'm good, to really kind of going hog wild with customizing the Docker compose file. So we start to see kind of some of the levels of abstraction that Doxil gives us, for example. There is a environment file in the .doxil directory called doxil.env, where, like, if you want to do things like specify the Acquia stack, it's just a one-line tweak in there. That's also where you would do things like flag on xdebug, for example. If you wanted to create a compose file, there's a simple command to do that, fin config generate, and you get your Docker compose file, and you can, again, you customize that to your heart's content. By default, the services you get from Doxil are a DB service, MySQL, a CLI service which is running PHP FPM, and a web service which is running Apache. Again, there's a bunch of other kind of system services that are in the background, but those are the main ones that we're interested in. So, a couple of steps to get set up, and then it's just fin start, and you have your site. What does it look like to work with applications? This is a lot cleaner, right? There's none of the user business. We don't have to run Docker Compose exec. Again, fin, these commands are really powerful. Lando we're going to look at in a second too. Both in terms of just like making the working with your environment more concise, but just a lot of additional functionality that's being baked into them as well. So starting and stopping is that simple. There is a fin exec command that essentially is just passing through to Docker Compose exec. So if we want to see the present working directory in the CLI container, it's that simple. We can drop into a bash shell with that concise command, etc. Similarly, if we wanted to add the Solar service as the example we're going to use, we just need to generate that doxil.yaml file, which is just a Docker Compose file. And uncomment lines for the Solar service. Our favorite Drupal tools, really concise way to run them, right? I mean, essentially you just have to append fin before the commands and you're running Drush within the container that you care about, for example, some of the console and composer. Again, we've got some really nice concise commands we can run here, and there's subcommand called db, which is really powerful as well. We can import and export really simply. For example, drop into a MySQL shell really simply. So, what extras do we get with Doxil? A lot more. There's a lot more packaged into Doxil than with Docker for Drupal, for example. There are the same kind of drop-in services. We want to add Solr. It's just uncomment a few lines in YAML. Really easy. There's this Acquia stack. Again, that could be really beneficial if you're deploying to Acquia. That's a one-liner to get your environment really close to what Acquia is doing. It's easy to override things like PHP and MySQL config. You can just do that within the .doxil directory. There's some specific file paths. Throw in a couple lines if you want to override one line of PHP config. It's just one line in one file in that directory. Some really nice integrations with other tools, especially around automated testing and CI. So Behat, PHP, Code Sniffer, SAS, Compass, etc. There's a lot of that you can get out of the box. You can create custom fin commands. All you need to do is create a script. At this point you're creating a script, presumably Bash, though there's other languages you could use as well. And just drop them in a particular directory with a particular name, and then you can execute them like fin my command. That could be really handy. Doxil has a concept of application aliases. So from anywhere on my local host machine, I can execute fin commands for any one of my given projects with fin at my project. That can be really handy as well. And then if you want to share your local publicly, you can do that with fin share. Doxil uses ngrok to do that, but that could be really powerful as well. If I'm hacking away on something and just want to temporarily share my local with another developer, got a really nice, convenient command to do that. Oh, shame stuff I'm not able to show you right now. I'm sorry, but we will at least look at the Doxil config file. Oops. Bear with me while I type. So you can see a really standard directory structure for a Drupal project. The only thing interesting is that .doxil directory. A lot of goodness is hidden in there, but that's the only thing we have to change from a high level. There, doxil.env is the environment file we were talking about. I'll take a quick peek at that. You get the idea of some of the things you might do in here. Here's where you would change the stack to Acquia, for example. Xdebug, you just have to flag that on and then restart your containers, and Xdebug will be listening for you. So these are some kind of environment variables you can set in doxil.env. And oops. If you look at the YAML file itself, again, at this point I would have run that fin generate config command, and now we have basically a vanilla Docker compose file, and we could go and edit this to our heart's content. Again, at the top level you can see the services, web, DB, and CLI. If we wanted to add Solr to our application, we just need to put in 3 lines like this, uncomment these, restart, and we've got Solr running. Really, really slick. Yeah, one of the things I was going to show you is that really, for me, just got the hooks in me really quickly is just startup time for containers for an app like this. I might even have it in my bash history. Crap, it's gone. Seconds, 10 seconds, your app is up and running, right? And compare that to a VM it's really night and day, especially if you're toggling between projects a lot. You're just up and running immediately. You can have multiple projects on your local, be switching back and forth between them, and it's super fast. All right, how am I doing on time? 45 minutes-ish? Okay. Lando, the last of the three we're going to look at, and again, you're going to see the same slides, obviously, compare this last tool set, and then we'll circle back around. So, Lando, I heard some people talking about it beforehand. It is kind of the hotness. Lando, these are all, I'm just blown away by these tools. They're really impressive in their own right. Just using Docker with Drupal, as I hope you're getting from me, it just feels like light years forward. Lando in particular has the biggest kind of scope of what it's trying to do. It's a really incredible tool. That you may view that as a positive or negative thing, but let's take a look. So Lando is maintained by a company called Tandem out of San Francisco. It is the successor to Calabox, if anybody used that before. I never used it. I think that was strictly a VM-based tool. It's a little interesting. I don't quite understand that succession because, as far as I understand, Lando is really a rewrite of Calabox. But Lando is still in beta. Your mileage may vary. It's beta release 33 or something like that. It's in really active development. I did see at least one warning in the release history about hey, beware of this major issue when changing between beta versions. Anecdotally, it feels really stable if you get in there and tinker around with it, but I haven't really put it through its paces, so something to be aware of. Again, a lot of Docker abstractions, even more so than with Doxil, and we'll look at some examples of that. But with Lando, they try really hard to get all of your configuration into this one .lando.yaml file, and that includes things that we would typically find in a Docker Compose file, as well as a lot of Lando isms, additional extensions beyond that Lando provides. And it really, it's all in YAML. So Lando pushes really hard to give you a lot of powerful configuration with just editing a few lines of YAML. It's really pretty impressive. So yeah, as you can hear me say already, it's really extensible. We're going to look at some specific ways you can extend it. But there's a lot of ways you can extend Lando, bend it to your will, make it your own. And Lando supports out of the box a number of recipes, as it calls them, which is again really Docker stacks, but with a lot of Lando specific extensions mixed in as well. So everything from D6 to 8, Backdrop, WordPress, the mean stack, .NET applications, Lando has services and kind of native support, just drop in place support for all of these different types of applications. Installation's really simple. You've got Docker installed already. There's a Lando installer for Mac or for Windows. Straightforward, and there's packages for your favorite Linux distribution as well. So installation's quick. What does it look like to set up an application? Again, we have our Drupal code base. Lando init does a lot of magic for us. Lando.yaml could be very, very simple. Could be 3 or 4 lines. I think 2 lines of YAML on the short end, and it can get crazy as well. Lando init's a nice shortcut. If you run Lando init, it'll give you some prompts, and it'll create your YAML file for you. A couple of optional things you can do that are interesting, though. You can select one of those recipes. We just listed a few of them. You can select one of those explicitly. So I want a Drupal 8 site, and it will specifically set up the configuration for that application. You can also, if you didn't have your codebase created yet, but let's say this is an application that's on Pantheon, or you have a repository on GitHub, you can pass that method in to Lando init, and it will handle that configuration for you as well. So there's a couple of options, but essentially you're up and running really quickly. Once you have your .lando.yaml file, it's just Lando start, and then you have your site. By default, Lando for Drupal 8, and I think for the default recipe, you just have two images, an app server and a database. It's really similar to what we saw with Fin and Doxil as far as working with applications. The Lando command, really powerful and really concise, so it's going to save you a lot of typing. And there's a lot of ways you can extend it as well. Don't necessarily need to tick through all these. I hope you guys can read that back there. And again, if we're thinking about like adding a service like Solar, it's just as with all of these, just editing a little bit of a few lines of YAML, and we can drop it in place. Similarly, for some of our favorite Drush Drupal commands, really concise, simple syntax for this. All right, Lando has a lot of extra functionality baked in. Like the other two options, there are a lot of services you can just drop into place. Just add them, uncomment them from your YAML config file, and you can add another service, Solar, Memcache, Elasticsearch, etc. Again, there's also a bunch of pre-made recipes. If you just want to select one of those when you initialize your app, like you're up and running immediately with whatever application is in that list. Lando has a concept of well, you can add in build steps to the lando.yaml file as well. So maybe I want to do a composer install every time I start or restart my application. You can specify that with a couple lines of YAML. That's really slick. Lando has an entire events framework. So if I want to, after every time I do a DB import, I want to do a cache rebuild, I can hook into the postdb import event and add a cache rebuild command. And this can all happen in the Lando YAML file. It has a concept of pre-run scripts as well, so if I want a series of scripts to run every time I boot up one of my containers, I just need to create the scripts in a certain directory. Has a ton of really nice, even a little bit more so than Doxil, tool integrations. Again, PHP code sniffer, Bhat, Travis, PHP unit, some really nice integrations around automated testing and continuous integration. Lando has a concept of what it calls tooling as well. So if there is a command like this one where I'm actually like running it via SSH and then passing in the command, I can use Lando tooling to alias that so that I can just Lando my command outside of the container as well. And there's an advanced plugin system and API if I actually want to get in there and start altering Lando itself and extending it, modifying it. There's a plugin system to do that. So it's really made to be customized and extended. Lando Share, similar to Fin Share, is a way to expose your local development environment publicly if you ever wanted to do that. It uses local tunnel to do that. So let's take a quick look at that Lando YAML file. How am I doing?
10 minutes.
All right, thank you. Perfect. These first few lines is really all I need. If I selected that Drupal 8 recipe, I've got those 4 lines of YAML and I'm done. And again, you may view this as a positive or negative thing, but I'm not having to deal with a lot of the normal Docker interactions. It's all kind of abstracted away through Lando. I'm not seeing Docker compose file at all, for example. If I wanted to add a service that Lando already has defined, that's it. 3 lines of YAML. And if I wanted to scrap all this, some of those abstractions and actually deal, like I love my Docker compose files, I can just specify, just point to the compose file here and kind of pass through. So, let's see. Yeah, a ton more you can do in here. I alluded to some of them a minute ago, but this is an example of a few of them. Look at poor Docker up here, tragically trying to start still. Shame. All right. That's it. We're just going to recap really quick. I want to talk through some of the high points. So Docker's really ready. If you're thinking about it, if you're on the fence, it's really ready to go. I think the kind of file system performance issues are the biggest problem area, but it's really ready to go otherwise. And again, that stuff is under really active development. You're going to see real benefits in onboarding, portability, and speed right off the bat. I'd encourage you to take the leap if you're thinking about it. Looking back at Docker for Drupal, it's wired for Wadby. If you're interested in that service, take a look. But really for today, it's just a great starting point. If you want to learn Docker, if you really want to be in there tinkering with Docker without the levels of abstraction, it's a great tool for that. It might be more familiar for non-Drupal folks, for example, or people that are just used to working with Docker. It could be a really good starting point if you want to take a compose file and customize it for yourself. There's a little bit more setup work. There's just more manual work, so and a little bit more kind of friction as you're going through your normal workflow. With Doxil, you start to get quite a bit of abstraction of some of the Docker concepts. It's really tailored for Drupal and WordPress. That may be a decision point if all you're doing is Drupal dev compared to Lando, for example. Doxil's more constrained. Fin is excellent. It's really, really helpful and powerful. Again, there is that. It requires VirtualBox and currently installs that VM on Mac or Windows. So anecdotally, you might get better performance out of that. It does mean a little bit slower startup time as well. Has really powerful integrations with a whole ton of tools, and if you're deploying to Acquia, has a stack pre-made for that, which can be really helpful. Lando, even further extracted in a sense from a lot of the Docker concepts. You have a crazy Swiss Army knife with that Lando YAML file. There's a lot you can do in there. It's less mature. Again, it's in beta. I don't really know. I'm not aware of any kind of roadmap for when to come out of that, for example, but something to be aware of. It supports, again, a really wide range of applications. If you're doing other development work besides Drupal and would like to have the same local development tool set, it could be a good choice for that. The Lando command, also incredible, really powerful. And it's very, very extensible as a system. I mentioned like 4 or 5 different ways you can extend Lando. If you really want to get in there and tune it for your own purposes, it's really powerful on that front. Integrates with a lot of tools, specifically around automated testing and continuous integration. And Lando has really tight integration with Pantheon as well, so if you're deploying to Pantheon a lot, it could be a good tool for that as well. I'll have a link to this, to my deck in the session description. I'll tweet it out as well. Here's a bunch of links, easy enough to find, but here they are in case. I want to call out to this link for this great image, which I love. It was really helpful, and the venerable reveal.js. But that's it. I don't know if there's any questions, any discussion. I know we're really close to time.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, cool. Yeah.
Just really quick, you said that when Docker, when you don't have you're not using volumes, that if you do Docker down, it persists the state of the container.
Other way around.
I mean, if you do Docker stop, it persists. If you do Docker down, it doesn't. What if you're not using volumes and your laptop freezes up? You have to do a hard reboot. Is it the container persisted, or
if the container hasn't been destroyed, then your data is still there. You can have a stopped container and the data, then it's still there.
right? But you don't explicitly do a stop. Your laptop freezes, so you don't get to say stop. You have to do a hard reboot.
Most likely your data is still in the container.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Just want to mention the Kafka integration a little bit. It's been really nice to use when you run Lando in it. For
Yeah.
project. You select the Pantheon one, it actually logs into Pantheon for you, pulls down a list of sites, and you select one that you boot it up. You just like grab it, copy, and that.
Awesome. I'm gonna.
In throughout development as well, you do a Lando pull, you pull database file. It takes a little bit longer, go get a sandwich,
I'll try to repeat the questions quickly just for the sake of the recording, but the gist of that was that the Lando integration with Pantheon is really slick. There's a lot you can do with it. Yeah.
I just want to say, it sounds like there's some people that are concerned about their Docker images being like gone, being destroyed. But if that happens, like I do that on a regular basis anyway, like destroy all the Docker images or delete that qcow2 file, whatever, to free up space since it's still kind of globs on. But anyway, the whole idea with Docker is that even if you destroy those containers, spinning them up again, I mean, it's very simple and fast. It's not like you have to download a 2 gig file for a VM anymore.
That's right. Yeah. So the comment was spinning containers back up is really quick and easy to work with, and I mean that's part of the whole. That's part of the whole ethos of Docker, right? Like containers should be coming and going often. You can the way you scale is to add a ton of additional containers, for example. So you do want to have volume set up for a Drupal application. Make sure your code base is outside of those containers, and then that's what you're supposed to do. Yeah, Jacob.
One other potential solution for the file system is to run natively in Docker, but then if you use PHP Storm, you can set deployment points where your code automatically gets deployed to your local Docker image. So you don't have to deal with like NFS or do parsing.
Right.
I think Doxil does some, there's an option to do that.
Docker sync.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Docker sync function, but I found if you have a PHP Storm project, it works great.
Interesting.
Deploy it locally, and then if you lose that code when you bring it down, it just automatically redeploys it.
Cool. So comment was about mitigating some of the file system performance issues. There's various ways you can do that. Jacob mentioned a technique with PHP Storm, but there's also a tool called Docker Sync, which is Ruby based, that you can use in that front as well. Yeah.
So, real quick, you can actually run it on Windows Bash Shell.
Okay.
They actually just released that recently, and you can use Docker natively for a Mac.
Yeah. Right. So the comment was you can use Windows Bash Shell and you can run Docker natively on the Mac. Doxil is, for example, starting to assume that moving forward.
Yeah, that's what I was just referring to.
Gotcha. Cool. Thanks. I think this hand was up first.
So you've done all this local development, and I get it with Pantheon and Lando, but what about other, how do you go from local then to production?
Yeah, I mean, that's the subject of another talk, really, is a long answer to that. There is a long answer to that.
Is there a short one?
I mean, yeah, there's really not, unfortunately. I'm happy to chat with you afterwards, though, about some ways you can do that. I think the key takeaway here is like we want to mimic our production environment as closely as possible. Docker gives us a set of tools to do that. How we actually get from here to there, that's another conversation. Yeah.
I had a question about Docker for Mac. I've got my guys using Docker Edge because it was so much faster than Docker Studio.
Oh,
is that
okay.
still the case? Does anyone know?
Good question. I'm really interested. Does anybody have experience with Docker Edge, and particularly if that helps mitigate some of the Docker for Mac issues?
It does.
It does.
I use a Linux host now, but it did when I was on my Mac.
Gotcha.
That was like last year.
My understanding is that the Docker team is working really hard on that, so I wouldn't be surprised if the Edge releases are way
It's
better.
night and day.
Yeah,
Months
interesting.
ago it was. I don't know what the
Yeah.
state
It
is
just
right now.
updated. They
Cool.
just released an update a couple of days ago. I can't remember. Maybe last week. That was supposed to have the new file system in it.
So,
Maybe
Okay.
that's the one you're...
I haven't.
Yeah, maybe. It's a source code.
yeah.
Classic, right? Like,
All right.
Tomorrow will be great, man.
yeah, it will be. You meet me back here tomorrow. I'm going to do this again. Are we at
Yep,
that? Okay. Cool. We should cut ourselves off, but really happy to keep chatting with folks around the rest of the conference about this. Thank you very much.